Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the afternoon session. And again, we have a great presentation that's going to be given on the open standard for zero trust architecture. The two presenters are Altaz Villani and John Linford. John Linford is a forum director within the Open Group Security Forum, and he's basically also the Open Trusted Technology Forum. He's a staff, and he supports the leaders and participants of the Security Forum to utilize the resources of the Open Group to facilitate collaboration and follow the Open Group standards process to publish their deliverables. It's a critical, I've been with the Open Group now for nearly 20 years now, and these directors are an absolutely crucial adjunct to getting successful products out the door. And I would encourage anybody that's listening, membership in the Open Group, there are very different facets. Please, okay, consider it, okay, for that, opengroup.org. Anyways, and prior to joining the Open Group, okay, John worked as a lecturer at San Jose State University, and he was teaching courses in economics for that. Altaz, he's a director of insights research at Security Compass, and he specializes in software security, threat modeling, and DevSecOps. He's currently vice chair of the Open Group Security Forum, a board member at Oasis, and on the Safe Code Technical Leadership Council. He participates in various industry and standards committee like IEEE, Cloud Security Alliance, and the Object Management Group, as well as the Open Group, to say the least. So without further ado, over to you, Altaz and John.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bob, for that introduction. Yeah, I am John Linford. I am the Open Group Forum Director for the Security Forum and Open Trusted Technology Forum, and am joined by my Security Forum Vice Chair, Altaz Villani. So we will emphasize we're representing the Open Group point of view here today, not Altaz's organization. So really quickly, and I promise this will go quick, just to sort of set the context for how we're getting to the topic of zero trust architecture today. It's useful to understand what the Open Group is and kind of how we function for how we're developing these work products. The Open Group is an international consortium. We have more than 850 member organizations across the globe that include customers and suppliers, as well as academia and in particular government. So we are a public-private partnership, which is kind of a critical thing here. One of those work groups is our Government Enterprise Architecture work group. And then we do also have initiatives currently going around digital transformation. The reason that that's kind of important is because the Open Group provides the legal and governance structure that allows all of these different types of organizations to come together to develop standards like this zero trust reference architecture that we're going to talk about today. We do emphasize on remaining open and vendor neutral, so the vast majority of what we publish is available on the Open Group library for free, well, for the price of an email. So that is a critical point here. What we do is as open as we possibly can make it. But let's get to the actual topic now of zero trust and zero trust architecture. What's critical here is that zero trust actually isn't really a new concept. It's just kind of the best way to describe it nowadays. All the way back in 2004, we had the origins of where we are now. One of those was from the Jericho Forum, which actually now is overseen and resides within the Open Group Security Forum, and their concepts of deperimeterization. So all the way back in 2004, we had this notion established that you can't really trust that just because someone is in your perimeter, you can give them access to whatever they want. And this is kind of around the same time that we started hearing the phrasing of the hard exterior and the soft, chewy center. At that same time, we also had stuff going around network access control architectures. A few years later, in 2010, we had Forrester actually coin the term zero trust. So that's when we started to hear use of it. Then in the next few years, we had Google publish their Beyond Corp papers that really started to act as the groundwork to what zero trust has become today. And now in 2022, even last year, 2021, we had multiple governments acknowledging zero trust and zero trust architecture as being critical for government, not just for private enterprise. We saw this back in May of 2021 with the US Executive Order 14028. The UK has their own zero trust architecture design principles. And then we also have zero trust architecture mentioned in the Canadian Network and Security Strategy. So this isn't just a private thing, this is definitely applicable to government. But what is zero trust? So what we're looking at here are the definitions that the Open Group's Zero Trust Architecture Working Group has defined. And these, critically, that group is a collaboration between the Security Forum and the Architecture Forum. So we've got both our security experts and our architecture experts looking at this. So it's not just one side or the other, which is crucial for zero trust. So zero trust is that information security approach that looks at data and information security, including that full life cycle of the data at rest, in motion, what have you. And it applies to any platform or network. So this means that any organization, whether public or private, are going to be able to secure that data or information, their applications, APIs, data integrations on any network, including the cloud, whether internal or external or even public. Zero trust then is implemented through a comprehensive strategy and provides that security framework that is data-centric and policy-driven. What this means is that organizations now have flexibility, agility, and adaptability, right? All of these being absolutely critical for any sort of digital transformation initiative. But you still are able to maintain the security assurances, the traditional ones, of confidentiality, integrity, and availability for your business assets. What's really important here is that when you go about implementing your zero trust architecture, you are leveraging existing investments and building new capabilities onto them. You're not throwing out everything that you had before and starting from scratch. And especially for government, especially when you're trying to get into that digital transformation, right? You don't want to have to be starting over in order to start offering those digital services to your customers or to your citizens. So why do we actually need zero trust beyond the fact that in the US, at least, it's been named in the US executive order? So, our National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, had to go and do stuff with it. But why do we need that beyond that? Well, changing business models and drivers. Of course, that big push to going digital. We're also seeing an evolving ecosystem in how organizations interact. In the private sector, at least, what is today's partner could be tomorrow's competitor, could be next week's acquisition. So you need to be able to handle all of those different interactions as quickly as possible to remain functional. We also have a changing technology landscape, right? Technology continues to develop extremely rapidly. So you've got to be able to keep up with this, especially for your security. And then, of course, we have changing regulatory, geopolitical, and cultural forces going on all over the world. So you need to make sure that your employees or your members or your partners, what have you, wherever they are in the world, they're able to have that security, or the assets that they're accessing are able to remain secure. We then have disruptive events, such as what's going on between Russia and Ukraine right now, or of course, if we look back a couple of years, that's still ongoing, COVID really changing the way that we tried to do business. And of course, going with that, the shift to remote work and online learning, where businesses and governments all of a sudden had employees that needed to work from home, and they needed to be able to access stuff securely from home. And zero trust, if implemented correctly, if implemented fully, provides that way to remain secure in those various ways. So at this point, I will go ahead and hand it off to Altaz, who can start to walk us through sort of what zero trust looks like today and some of the critical things needed to actually implement a zero trust architecture.
Thanks, John. If you can just go ahead while I'm talking, just build the slide and then I'll talk about the content there. Thank you. So as John had mentioned, there is work right now that is going on around zero trust from a number of different communities. We are aware of the work that NIST is doing, and we in fact have been working with them, collaborating with them. There's some history at the Open Group, which stems from the Jericho Forum, and a lot of those principles have carried forward into what we call zero trust today. One of the things that we wanted to make sure was that we don't contribute as an open standards group. We don't want to contribute towards adding confusion. We want to bring clarity. We want to define things. We want to work with other communities to look for areas where there's convergence. Eventually, we do believe that there's going to be a set of core principles that will emerge that will be generally accepted. We've taken an initial stab at those principles, which we will share with you. But if you look at where zero trust is today, there is a growing consensus on the strategic nature of zero trust, a perimeter-centric model which is based on networks, firewalls. It's useful, but we found that it actually needs to go beyond that into the asset level, and I'll talk a little bit about how that unfolded in our sort of the recommendations that we're making and the principles that we've put forth in the industry. But that's essentially what's happening. The areas around definitions and standards are rapidly emerging. There's even from a broad zero trust perspective, if you take a step back, there are a couple of different approaches that people are taking. One is to look at it from a data-centric perspective, and the other one is to look at, for example, network microsegmentation. So we're aware of the work that's happening at the Cloud Security Alliance, for example, and as I've mentioned, some of these other groups as well. But these standards are evolving, they're emerging, and we want to make sure that we're contributing towards where this is going in terms of the narrative itself. There are certain key characteristics that seem to be mapping here in terms of where zero trust is today. It is moving towards asset centricity. It is something that is moving towards something that is more around beyond just the firewall itself. It's based on adaptive access controls, holistic access across the entire tech estate. So it's not just dealing with the network, but it's dealing with the IT systems, OT systems, and so on. It also has to do with continuous improvement. Bear with me. Folks are saying that they're having a difficult time hearing me. Okay, so I've increased my volume there. If we can go to the next slide as well, please, John. Thank you. So what we've done in the next few slides is we've moved ahead, and what you will see is we've got certain principles, which are the title of the slides, and then we've got what we call commandments. And these are all things that eventually work out into trust reference architecture, which we're working on at the moment. But we're going to each one of these things one at a time. So the first principle is just zero assumed trust. We, in the past, would log into some kind of a network, and we would find that there were, once you ended up going through the network, you had access to a number of different systems. And so you assumed that you've got a certain amount of credentials, access, authorization to access information. But that is no longer the case. Really, when we talk about trust, it's all about validating that trust explicitly. So the assurance relies explicitly on validating trust decisions based on information, based on policies, based on the changing environment. For example, if someone comes in and they're now a contractor, they will have certain access to certain assets. And then if they end up becoming an employee, they've got a different set of access credentials, things like that. And it's constantly emerging. But if you look at the bottom, ultimately, when we talk about zero assumed trust, there are two things that are really important. What we're trying to do, first of all, is to reduce the threat space. So if you look at the external environment coming in, what we want to do is we want to make sure that if we've got things that need to be protected, we go right down to the asset level. And so it's easier when we get down to that granular level to be able to go and to support greater agility, because we can now move away from something that was largely coarse-grained, and we had firewall rules that would try and determine who has access to what. But now we could go in and say, even if we are in a model where we've got an acquisition or a divestiture, for example, right down at the asset level, we have the ability to go in there and explicitly validate the trust level that is required in that environment. The other side of it, which is the flip side of the coin, is to reduce the blast radius. Should something happen, and we are now moving in the realm of an assumed breach or assumed compromise environment, then in such a situation, what we'll find is we want to limit how far the compromise itself will go. So if something is based on an individual asset, an individual piece of data, it's limited to the policies surrounding that. And again, because we are not assuming that we've got trust with other assets, we are now able to go in there and limit how far the impact of that particular breach will will essentially go. Next slide, please, John. The next principle is a focus on the business. Now, when we talk about a focus on the business, there are three areas. First of all, we want to make sure that it enables modern work. And the environments in today's business context are shifting radically. We've got new capabilities that are emerging. We've got new goals, new environments. Infrastructure is continually evolving, cloud, hybrid environments. All of this needs to work in a way that enables us to go and allows the work to proceed. So security in this sense, zero trust specifically, becomes an enabler for where the business is going and how we can achieve the business objectives. Second is the security is done based on value of the asset. So historically, when you look at, for example, threat modeling, or when you look at what's the impact of a particular breach on the design side, architecturally, we struggled with trying to go and make sure that we had assets that were in fact relevant to what was important to the business. And so by doing that, the security controls themselves
We might have just lost Altats. He might be having.
Okay, John, can you take over, please?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and keep going. Hopefully he can get back in here. Yeah, so we do want to make sure that we're looking at securing assets by value. So you're looking at making sure that what you're actually protecting, the controls that you're putting around it, the security that you're putting on it is appropriate for the type of asset that you're actually looking at. If it is a really low value asset, you probably don't need to be putting tons and tons and tons and tons of controls around it. However, for your crown jewels, you're probably going to want a bit more security. The flip side of this is, though, that you also want to look at the expected risk. So what are your expectations around somebody or something trying to get in to compromise it? Even if something is incredibly valuable to your business, if nobody's ever going to try to get at it, then you probably are going to be looking at a different way of securing it than if somebody were trying to attack it every 30 seconds. Sort of the final one in this category of focusing on the business is to be implementing asset-centric controls. So we're looking at implementing controls that are specific to the asset itself, rather than having some sort of broad infrastructure control. This means that we're trying to minimize disruption of productivity and instead increase the precision of the security or business visibility. So we are looking at making sure that things are secured according to what they're worth. They are, the controls around them do make sense for the type of asset being secure. And all of this is working toward ensuring that the business is able to stay productive. We're not putting layers and layers and layers of stuff that people have to get through so that it takes them an hour to get anything done in the first place. The other important thing here is that when we say business, we do mean this kind of at the highest level. Every different type of organization, whether public or private, is going to have some sort of business goal. So you could easily replace this with enterprise, you could replace it with organization. We used the term business here just to make sure that the private sector in this publication understood that we were driving at. The next set of these principles focus around making it easy for employees to do the right thing. If you put too much security in place, if you put the wrong quote types of security in place, rather than trying to do things correctly, we found that employees are just going to try to get around it. So we want to enable having pervasive security in the organization. So the security discipline needs to be integrated into the culture, norms, and processes of the organization. What we've been hearing a lot is that security is a team effort. So everybody needs to be working together to ensure that things are secure, that they're following the correct processes and protocols put in place. And going through a zero trust transformation as part of your digital transformation, part of that is ensuring that your employees are on the same line, the same way of thinking about security as the security team. We also want to make sure that we're trying to enable simple and sustainable security. So we want these security controls to be as simple as possible while still remaining practicable, scalable, and sustainable for the full life cycle of that asset. We don't want to be just increasing complexity just to increase complexity. If we are increasing complexity, we need to be able to have thought through it and decide that, yes, it does in fact make sense to have increased it in this way for these reasons, rather than just making it more difficult because you can. The final point in this grouping is around utilizing least privilege. So this is a term that's probably been used especially by Microsoft. We've seen it used a lot. But we want to make sure that all of these individuals only have access to the things that they need when they need them. So they have the least amount of privilege required at that time. So access to your systems and data are only provided as long as required, and then it's removed when it's no longer required. This one actually came about through discussions with people who'd been part of various organizations for decades, and they still had access to the same systems and data from the first month that they were an employee to their role currently, despite the fact that they'd changed group within the organization. They changed roles multiple times. They needed access to very different things now, but they were still able to get into and access all of those things from the very beginning. So as employees move throughout the organization, as their roles change, as their tasks change, we want to make sure that they're able to access what they need for those specific things, while removing access to things that are no longer required, so that if that user's credentials or access information, what have you, are compromised, the attacker using them is only able to get to a minimal amount of things. And it looks like we might have Altaz back.
Yes, I'm back. My apologies. Windows just did an update on me. Sorry about that. So when we, John, have you gone through this slide?
Just hand it to you for this one.
Great. So the other principle is Agile and adaptive security. When we take a look at Agile and adaptive security, it's really intending to go and move away from the idea that security policies are going to remain constant, which has been a struggle when we've gone and tried to create rules to help us manage our security. So adaptive security implies that depending on the context, you will go and your policies will help drive how you adapt to the environment itself. And depending on the context, the user, the device, the network, and even the data itself that you're looking to connect to. And there are two core ideas that emerge from the idea of being agile and adapting to the context in terms of security. The first is continuous improvement. So security teams shall continuously evolve and improve. So when we look at that context, really it's looking at how do we make sure that we are improving our security in the environment that we're operating in, and anticipating that we're going to have these continual changes. People that have worked in environments where we've got a rigid network structure, or even if we take a look at microsegmentation around a network of one, for example, it can be extremely difficult when we have to try and manage access through those kinds of rules and into, through firewalls and opening and closing ports, that type of stuff. So we need a level of abstraction that will go a little bit above that, and yet at the same time allow us to evolve as our business needs continue to evolve, as the capabilities that we're building into security continue to evolve as well. And the second is making informed decisions. So this is about telemetry, making sure that information is coming in from various aspects from our security environment. So today, one of the problems is really based on the fact that it's not the shortage of tools, it's the ability to go in and collect the data that's coming from all of these tools to help us make informed decisions. And it's the insights that will help us drive out what we need to do from a security perspective. So if you consider in the context of agility, going in and adding yet more tools that give us yet more data and collecting it into some kind of a data lake can be noisy. And trying to pull this stuff up a level higher so that we could go in and create policies that will allow us to drive more at the policy level is something that is driven through the data that we collect. And thereby helping to inform the decisions that we need to make from a security perspective. So we are aware, for example, that if you look at the work that NIST has done, they do talk about a policy engine. And even when we're looking at taking the work at the Open Group and looking at a reference architecture for zero trust, the idea of bringing in policy level constraints is really central to what we're trying to do. We are aware that there's no single tool that will do all of this stuff. Even when we talk about agile and adaptiveness from a security perspective, it will take a collection of tools And it's the telemetry from these tools that will allow us to continuously improve and make the necessary informed decisions. So for example, if we're dealing with HIPAA compliance, it may be that when we go and look at even data in the databases, we might need to have encryption enabled. We might need to make sure that we've got correct security across the pipeline. When data is in transit, we need to take a look at the velocity of the data itself. A lot of these kinds of things begin to emerge. And I think this is the right time to talk about zero trust, in the sense that we're not, at least from the open group's perspective, we don't envision zero trust as being a revolutionary approach to security. Zero trust is just a natural evolution. We had security at the individual node level at one point. We would have users log into their own computers and their systems. And then we decided to network things. Now we decided to do network security. And as we continue to evolve that, now it's not just the network security, but it goes one step beyond that. And it really is across any network at this point. And that's what zero trust is about. It should be able to function outside the bounds of the network context itself. And this is what we're talking about when we say continuous improvement and informed decisions, as it aligns with agility and adaptive security. Next slide, John. So what we did was we took all of this and brought it together, and we said, all right, we've come up with these principles, and within each of these principles, we've got these commandments. What should we be doing? What shall we do? And this is what we've come up with at this point. We've published this material. You're welcome to go to use it to drive the work that you're doing around zero trust. We would love to hear how it's working for you. But it really comes down to validating trust explicitly, enabling modern work, pervasive security, assets by value, using asset centricity, which is a shift from the network centricity model that we've had historically, enabling simple and sustainable security over time, just making sure that things are scalable and it goes across the full life cycle of the asset. So if you take a look at a data life cycle, if you take a look at a policy life cycle, if you look at an asset life cycle, like a system life cycle, an enclave, all of these things start to come in when we look at enabling how we might have zero trust work in that context. Using least privilege, things that we've had in the past, but now we've got an umbrella term, zero trust, that we can pull all of this stuff under. Continuous improvement and making informed decisions. As we were evolving and talking about these commandments, we realized that not every organization is going to be able to meet all of these commandments. So these commandments are intended to provide a vision and enable a journey, and in so doing can be used in the context of helping to develop a strategy. What do we have today? Where do we want to go tomorrow? What does it mean in terms of our capabilities? And are we aligning with these commandments and principles that the Open Group has put forward? So on that, from that perspective, please consider zero trust as a journey. It's not an end state to say we are now zero trust compliant, but much more so about how do we continue to evolve zero trust? What are we learning from this, and where do we kind of take it in the future? Just to let you know, within the Open Group, when we look at the zero trust group itself, this is just one aspect of what we've worked on. We also have a survey, and we're planning to take information from people that participated in the survey, and it was a broad set of constituents. We had people from academia in there, people from the commercial industry, we had people from the federal space, the government space, and it's trying to get a balanced perspective on where zero trust can play and what benefit zero trust can provide. Next slide, please, John.
Before we move off this, I'll just add one final point. You did hit on it, but I really want to emphasize zero trust is not an end state. So even if you get to the point where you are able to secure assets by value, and you do have controls and stuff put in place around value, asset, and expected risk, you should be reassessing them. You should be looking at them sort of continuously and saying, has our asset value changed? Has our expected risk changed? You don't just kind of implement and say, okay, I'm done, brush my hands and move on to the next thing. All of these things you need to be looking at continuously, which really is where that improved continuously aspect comes into this. So zero trust, it's not just a journey. It's a continuous journey where you can continuously get better. But you don't have to do all of these at once. You can implement things as you're able to make steady progress. And then when you look back 6 months, a year, 3 years from now, what have you, it'll be astounding to sort of how much better you are today than you were back then.
Yeah. So I think that's important to also, when we take a look, just as an example, we have data tokenization as an example. If you look at data tokenization, why do we need to do that? Now, there may have been certain legal requirements, regulatory issues that would have sort of pushed us in the direction to say we must do this. That kind of stuff can be used in zero trust as well. So it's not undoing everything we've done. It's taking what we've done and evolving it really to the next stage. Because if we take a look at data centricity, on the data itself, if you consider who's got access to it, you begin to open it up and say, well, certain people have access to be able to read the data itself in pure form. You've got others that need to look at the information because they need to test it. Maybe they're doing some development, in which case you don't need to have the actual data. You could just have a representation of that data. What happens if you need to go to a third party? Well, does that third party really need access to this information? So a lot of people will notice that the principles themselves are just a natural evolution of what we've been doing, right? It's just that zero trust brings it from something that was largely like a much sort of coarser grained network paradigm to something that is more granular, more at the data level, but it does mean that we need to consider more variables, as we mentioned earlier. So who's got access, what device are they using, on what network, at what time, like so on and so forth. And you start to build out a policy based on these variables. Next slide, John. So if we take a look at zero trust differentiators, we continually ask ourselves, within the open group, in this zero trust working group that we have, what makes zero trust different compared to the way we've been doing security in the past? Where's that point of evolution exactly? We talk about it, but let's define it. So there are three areas that we felt where there's this evolution of moving from the way we used to do security to where the next stage of security is. The first is this idea of asset centricity that we've talked about. So if you look at digital enterprises, whether it's e-government or whether it's looking at something in the commercial space to go in there and provide a set of new services and looking at innovation and trying to go faster than competition, so on and so forth. If we go right down to the granular level, we're dealing with applications and APIs and systems, making sure that we are focused at that level and making sure that it isn't just about an environment that is in the IT space, which is where we focused a lot of our attention, but it is even within that space, it's got operational elements and it's got development components, but even beyond that, when we take a look at IoT, for example, we look at industrial control systems and IoT, when we start to look at instrumentation and looking at telemetry with these other paradigms as well, we need to make sure that OT and IoT assets also go in, and the nuances involved within those contexts are also allow us to go in there and maintain the security posture of our portfolio, of what we're looking at. So that's one area. It's about assets now, specific granular assets compared to networks. Second is this idea of adaptive access controls. It isn't about a rule, sort of static rules that we use and then have to go in there and struggle with trying to keep these rules up and running. It's a level that is really based on policy-based administration, looking at something that goes beyond just the network, although it is possible to have a network of one with microsegmentation, as we're seeing some groups are proponents of that. But the idea still is all around adaptive access control. We should be able to modify this, and if something comes up and we find something in a production environment, for example, the policy should be updated. Once the policy is updated, every time someone goes in and tries to access a particular asset, it goes against the policy engine. The policy engine says, yes, you have access to this, or you do not. And from there, you're able to go in there and control just the impact of something that could potentially go wrong. So we've got asset centricity, we've got adaptive access control, and the third thing is all around the data centricity. So you'll notice we've got asset and we've got data. And we're being intentional about this. Asset sometimes has a legacy connotation that it involves infrastructure components and network components. That's not what we're talking about. So we have intentionally talked about data centricity although you could consider data to be a type of asset, but we call it out explicitly here. When we talk about data centricity, it is looking at the full life cycle of the data itself, which is at the lowest level. Who's got access to it? What does it mean in the context of zero trust? How do we enable the business to move forward? All the principles that we talked about, all of that starts to intersect now with this data centricity mindset. So these three things, these three areas, asset centricity, adaptive access control, and data centricity are what's kind of pushing us in the direction of what's different about zero trust. So when we look at the capabilities of a general security model that we've had up until now, there will be capabilities that we can reuse and repurpose and allow us to go in and move towards zero trust. But we also need to be aware that there are some things that we probably need to modify. We might need to create new capabilities as it pertains to data centricity. Imagine you've got a DevOps team, and that DevOps team now needs to think about data centricity. What does it mean for access, not just to the application itself, but what about access to the data? Or is that something that we want to have within the data layer itself? So these are all discussions that now begin to emerge when we take a look at zero trust. Ultimately, if you look at the bottom, this is our insight in the differentiators around zero trust. The current perimeter-centric approaches don't provide the agility and adaptability required by the digital enterprise. Trying to go in and create these firewall rules is really a hindrance when you have to move very quickly. We need to go down to a level that is much more granular, but from a security perspective, it's controlled by a policy engine. There's a constant pursuit of solving just for the last threat. So it's very reactive. When you take a look at the current approaches, we look at the log files, we see what's penetrating our firewalls, and we kind of take that approach. Whereas if we look at it from a policy perspective, we're able to preemptively go in, change the policies, and in so doing, even systems that may not have been compromised yet get the benefit of that particular policy that we've got. So we do believe that in a world that is continually evolving and the threats continue to increase, it's just not sustainable, where we've got this idea that we need to take a look at the threats, look at the exposure from those threats, and try and adapt ourselves accordingly. We need something that will allow us to move much more fluidly, much more in line with what the business needs are. Next slide, John.
Yeah, back to me. So where are we now for the work the ZTA working group is doing, that the open group is doing? A couple years ago, just over a year ago, actually, now we published the Zero Trust Core Principles. It was our first cut at it. It was based on some of the learnings from that survey that Alt has mentioned, and it was a white paper and meant to rustle some feathers. From there, our thinking evolved a little bit with some more time, with some more learnings, and we got the Zero Trust Commandments, which is sort of the next step higher that we just walked through with you today. Both of those available in the Open Group Library. We are currently working on what is our first Zero Trust reference model that will eventually evolve and become a Zero Trust reference architecture. We are developing this using a draft process. So we will be publishing iterative drafts. We do want feedback. We do want to make sure that what we are putting out works for the people who are going to be using it. We don't want this just to be focused on the private sector. We want to make sure that governments are able to take this and implement and run with it. What's important here is that we are working very closely with NIST in the US on this as well. The Open Group is taking more of a top-down approach, whereas NIST is kind of taking a bottom-up technology approach. So we are making sure that what we're doing is going to come together and meet in the middle so that we're not just adding to the confusion that already exists in this space. We want to make sure that people understand what Zero Trust is and are able to do it consistently to be as secure as they can, as reasonably as they can, while remaining cost-effective and keeping security as an enabler of what the organization is doing and not a prohibitor. And with that, I do just have a few resources here. So there is also a separate webinar on the Zero Trust commandments if you want to hear folks other than Altaz and Anthony speak about them. And I think with that, it's time for some questions.
Yeah, let me just jump in here as well, just to say, we'd mentioned in the past here that this is evolving, right? originally, when we were looking at zero trust, we had it fully in mind that we would like to create a reference architecture, a reference model, something that we could make it very practical. However, before we got to that stage, it was important for us to put a stake in the ground to say, what are some definitions? What are some terms? What are some principles that are going to help guide us at the Open Group as we start to evolve the zero trust reference architecture? So there will be more work coming out from the Open Group. It will be based on what we've done so far. And we really would love to get your thoughts, your feedback as a community. Let us know. We'd love to hear from you as well.
Okay, well, that's great. Well, thank you ever so much, Altaz and John. I'll ask the audience quickly, how many of you have people with 4 or 5 computers on their desk and 4 or 5 screens are desperately trying to integrate the data from them? And for all of those who are victims, or shall we say, victims of the multi-level security and this tendency to go from network-centric to data-centric security and attribute-centric security is important. And that ties into the previous presentations on data management and metadata management. That's going to be critical, and that's one reason it's pervasive throughout the enterprise. So without further ado, I'm just going to ask some questions. We have a lot of them. I don't know if we can get through all of them. Okay, within the context of asset-centric controls, okay, what do you do for bring your own device? And how about the privacy of the data and contents on the personal device? Over to you.
Yeah, so I can jump in and I can offer some thoughts on this, and then John, you can do the same as well. So BYOD was in fact a use case that we had considered. So was remote work and digital enterprise involvement and all that kind of stuff. So when you take a look at BYOD specifically, the first thing is when you have a device that needs to access a particular asset, the traditional approach has been, if I've got access to the network, I will have access to certain pieces of data inside the enterprise. What Zero Trust does is every time I go in and I want to access a particular asset, I need to make sure that I've got the ability, the access in terms of the rules, the policies that will enable that to happen. So for example, I could have a device, and that device may be limited to just working hours where I can access particular pieces of data. When we look at data that sits at rest on the device itself, the policy around that would be that the data at rest must be encrypted. Or if the data needs to reside, it could also be done through tokenization. We might have encryption, homomorphic encryption, or things like that. What Zero Trust does is it goes down to the data level and says, where's the data traveling from the device to the network, through the network to the enterprise itself and back. And within that context, along the way, who's got access to what, who's got the right to see certain things, and it's the policy that determines that. So even if the device needs to access something internal to the enterprise, it still has to go through the policy engine. Again, keep in mind, one of the principles is no assumed trust. Even if I've got an app, and even if the app has got data on it, that device may be compromised. So do we still want to make sure that, that we give access to that? No, we need to go in there, and there are rules around what needs to be on the device, the kind of cryptographic rules that we have around the device that enable access to the particular asset. That's where Zero Trust comes in. It's more about thinking at the data level itself. So I hope that answers the question. It's a big question because it starts to now tip into a reference architecture when you start to take a look at what are the different pieces of data that you need to go in and help you enable this. But hopefully it gets you just a starting point to help you understand what that means from a BYOD perspective. It is absolutely something that we have considered in our discussions.
Not an easy issue to address. That's for darn sure. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is, let's see, we got someone with 2 votes. Conceptually speaking, are there any major distinctions between a denied by default philosophy versus Zero Trust, or are these essentially commensurate?
Yeah, I'll give some thoughts on this. Denied by default, traditionally has been based on networks, sort of a network paradigm. You will be denied access to the network, unless you've been given explicit permission. If you look at it from a data-centric perspective and say we will deny access to everyone unless the policy says that you've got access to it, this starts to get into one of the things that we talked about in the principles, which is that only give access to the degree that an individual needs in order to perform what they need to do. So by default, we're assuming that there's an assumed breach position. So you will only get access if the policy itself enables you to get access to it. So it is a carryover from the network paradigm where we had firewall rules that denied access, and now we take it down to the data level itself. It is a similar kind of mindset where we look at it and we say, yes, you don't need access to this. If you do, what is the rationale for it, and what is the policy now that we're going to put around it? Because keep in mind that data, we cannot assume the data sits in our network. It could sit on any network, right? So we need a policy that crosses across these different networks that enables us to go in there and have access to it. So I hope that sort of clarifies, what we're talking about here. It is absolutely based on the idea that you only give access as needed, but let's make sure it doesn't get caught up in a network-centric view of the world. It is really data-centric ultimately.
It's part of the evolution, and it's a definite challenge as you go forward for that. Okay, we got another question. How does zero trust relate to the trustless nature of blockchain? Are there elements of the blockchain technology that encourage a decentralized approach to data security?
Yeah, so that's an interesting use case. We haven't talked extensively about blockchain and the integration of blockchain as it pertains to zero trust. There are some interesting use cases around this that emerge, particularly when we look at how we construct our assets themselves. So for those in the government space, there's a lot of discussion now on SBOMs, for example. Could we go in there and construct the SBOM using blockchain technology to ensure that the assets themselves and the necessary configurations from a security perspective are not tampered with, so we could go back from an auditing perspective? Makes for an interesting use case, but I don't want to step out of bounds here. We have not set any guidelines, so we don't have anything as it pertains to blockchain and zero trust. But I would invite the group that posed that question, please join us at the open group. We would love to hear the specific use case that you're thinking about and how we might be able to go and integrate blockchain into a zero trust context as well. Thank you for that question.
Okay, would you be able to indicate the best way to manage zero trust? It sounds administratively intense.
Yeah, we spoke about this as well. The intent here is not to go in and start to create a bunch of extra work. Where we feel, if we look at a network-centric approach, it will fall into that because you have to now manage firewall rules quite extensively. And that becomes a challenge, particularly when you look at the contexts that we outlined earlier. In fact, if you look at the way policies are constructed, it becomes easier to manage in the sense that you're driving your security now by policies rather than rules at the network layer. Now, having said that, does it not mean that when you're looking at the world from a zero trust perspective that you have to rationalize and rethink your security model so that you're not dealing with a network, but you're thinking more in terms of the data itself? Yes, there are some capabilities you have to think about. You have to strengthen certain capabilities. You may need to develop new capabilities, but from an ongoing, like a maintenance perspective, from the ability to go in there and manage security from a policy standpoint, it is our opinion that it actually becomes easier because you're having to manage things at a level that is an abstraction of your entire network. So it's not going network by network, but it's taking it asset by asset, data piece by data piece in that sense. So if you've got the policy at that level, you could go in and you can now manage it accordingly. But again, it doesn't mean that you go in and you're going to do it at the level of like a column within a database each time. It may be, depending on the kind of asset that you've got, that you will open it up and allow others access to it. And that's okay. So it now gets into an asset classification paradigm where you think about it, and that becomes a capability that you will need to build in order to go in there and enable zero trust. Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and basically administration, if you're dealing with the enterprise holistic point of view, it's not the security architect that ends up doing everything, or the security guys. This is pervasive throughout the enterprise. This becomes part of your DNA, so to speak, that people automatically put in the proper metadata, and the enterprise architecture will basically say what type of metadata is required. And of course, the security architect will be key to determining that. So administration is going to be diverse. It's going to be throughout the enterprise.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, Bob. We are writing this material with the architects in mind, not just the security architects, but the enterprise architects as well. There's a bridge that occurs between security and what's going to enable the business. So there may be new factors that will come in the future. There may be some legal constraints. There may be other things, and this will help continue to refine the policy. So zero trust in that sense is this ongoing journey, but you approach it from the asset itself.
Okay, great. And we got one more question. Okay, what advice do you have about changing the risk culture to be more quantitative? It looks like zero trust hinges on part on being able to have specific and quantifiable insights into the likelihood of risk.
Oh, I'm taking this one, Altaz.
Oh yeah,
Go for it, John.
Go ahead.
No, that's exactly right. There is definitely an implicit, you need to be doing some sort of quantitative risk analysis here. If you're going to be securing assets by value and you're going to be looking at expected risk, you need to be talking about them in the same terms. You need to be looking at cost and benefit. If you've got an asset that you say is high risk, what on earth does that mean? Do you need high controls? Do you need medium controls? Yeah, no, that's definitely an important part of it, is putting everything in terms of, how frequent are these losses going to occur? What is the size of the losses that are going to occur? What are the ranges of losses that are going to be occurring? Is this, $1 billion loss once in 100 years? Or is this $1 billion loss once a month? Right, that kind of information is really critical to making sure that what you put in place aligns with what's actually being secured. And then, of course, that goes back to enabling the business, right? You're putting this in the same terms, the same language, the same units that your decision makers are using. So when you go and say, we've got our crown jewels, we need to be putting controls in place to make sure that they are secure. Here's how much those controls are going to cost. If we have those controls in place, here's how much our risk is reduced over the lifespan of that asset. It becomes a much simpler task to actually get approval to implement those controls, rather than, yeah, they're high risk, we think we should spend a lot of money.
Okay, well,
yeah.
Sorry, Altaz, go ahead.
I was just going to say real quick. So, when we talk about culture, part of culture involves the processes that we use as well. So, one of the challenges historically has been that there isn't a consistent risk process depending on which department, which unit you talk to. So moving towards a quantitative approach is trying to create objectivity around that. So the security, the open group does in fact have the standard, the FAIR standard. So we are looking at ways to integrate that objective methodology into the work we're doing. And even when we take a look at zero trust, there will eventually be an intersection with this kind of objective quantitative based approach. Sorry, Bob, go ahead.
Well, it's nothing to be sorry about. Absolutely delighted. And, just the audience remembers that risk is signed off by the business, so they've got to be aware of this. They've got to understand it. Thank you very much, John and Altaz, for taking the time to present to the conference. It's really appreciated, and I really support the work that you're basically doing at this point in time. Now, I would like to bring everybody's attention to the fact that we're going to be talking about cyber awareness and cyber education in the next two sessions. We have Karen Wetzel from the National Institute for Science and Technology talking about the initiative, the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education, okay, better known as NICE. And we also have then Okay, Ms. McAllister, who's going to be presenting, Angela is going to be presenting the Canadian cybersecurity framework, which is basically a derivation of the NIST framework. And we're trying to push cyber education, believe it or not, into high school. So this is no longer just something that's theoretical, that people grow up with it. So anyways, I thank you very much for the presentation. That was great. And with that, I'm going to close the session and get ready for the next one, where Karen Wetzel is going to give us some information on NIST and educating the masses. There we go. Take care. Thank you.